So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ron Lewis. Many of you may know Dr. Lewis. He is a professor of animal breeding and genomics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He earned an animal science degree at the University of California, Davis, and a master's degree in animal breeding at Texas A&M before completing a doctorate degree in animal science at Virginia Tech. He has served as the NSIP technical advisor for many years, and I think we all owe Ron a huge thank you for his influence and impact on the genetics within the U.S. sheep industry. He has had an incredibly influential career over these many, many years, and we wouldn't be where we're at today in regards to the technology and the selection tools we have available without Dr. Lewis. I'd also like to mention Dr. Lewis will be recognized with the Camp Tender Award tomorrow at the awards lunch. So let's give Dr. Lewis a huge hand and thank him for his impact.
Well, welcome and thank you for this opportunity to talk about something that we often seem to forget when we get enamored by all the new technologies, is that they really are built on a foundation which is still relevant. So when Rusty asked me to speak about this, I grabbed at the opportunity, but I recognized in thinking about what the key basics are that it'd be valuable to ask some really clever people. So I surveyed 5 experts, what they thought. I asked them for 3 ideas each, but as animal breeders, we count poorly. And so I ran into a bit more than I was anticipating. But these were the basics. They were very consistent in what they thought you ought to know about. First is something called the breeder's equation. And we'll take a fair bit of time talking about what that means, because it's really the foundation of what we do in an animal breeding program. Establishing where we want to go in our breeding program. We often don't invest enough time in doing that, but it's key to what we do. Interpreting, rather than perhaps explaining how we estimate them, but interpreting what an estimated breeding value is and perhaps why it matters. Defining something called a contemporary group. And lastly, using crossbreeding, which is a really effective tool that we sometimes overlook. Now, this is a course in animal breeding and genetics, which takes a semester to teach. So this is going to kind of be like a Shakespearean experience when there's a group that says, we're going to go through all of Shakespeare's plays in an hour. And so I'm going to do something like that about animal breeding. All right? So let's give this a go. Oh, the other thing. There will be a quiz. All right? Given that this is like a course, there must be a quiz. So you should have your phones out with your calculators ready to go. Make sure we're all on the same page. All right? Okay. So given that, need to kind of start with thinking about how we describe what we call a performance record, which is P in this formula. So P is what we record on farm or on ranch. And animal breeding is really pretty easy, because what we need to do is to disentangle what P means in terms of 2 key components. One is the environment, which are the things that you do in managing your flock, the climate, weather patterns, everything's that are environmental. But what we're really interested in getting a hold of in an animal breeding program is the genetic bit. We want to disentangle that from the environment, because when we want to give you an estimate of the genetic merit of your animals, it's all about the G. So what we do in animal breeding is figure out ways to get G separated from E based on the performance record P that you give us. That's what I do. That's my day job. Okay? Couple of terms that I'll use to make sure we're on the same page. The genotype that we call G is really equivalent to what we call the breeding value, or BV. And what the mainstay of a genetic evaluation program is to estimate that breeding value. And that's all what an EBV is, an estimated breeding value. It's our best estimate of the genetic merit of your animals for a particular trait. Okay? And we build everything around that. P equals G plus E. If you're in California, that's a gas company, but we're going to be doing something different here. All right? Okay. So let's start with understanding the breeder's equation. It is an equation that combines all of the main factors that impact response to genetic selection. And this is the equation. All right? Now, my wife is a musicologist, and when I show her this equation, she thinks it looks like modern jazz, which she does not like. All right? When I show it to students, they think it is chaos theory. As an animal breeding, I think it is poetry. And so I want to convince you why I think it's poetic by working through all of the bits and pieces as to what makes up that equation. It's not as overwhelming as it might seem. Okay? So let's start with the first bit. Delta BV divided by T. That is no more than our symbol for genetic response per year that you would achieve in your flock. And to give you an illustration of what that looks like, these are records based on NSIP from one of the breeds. And what we have along the vertical axis is genetic response in pounds, because we're talking about weights. Along the horizontal axis is time over 10 years. And what you see is that over time, for birth weight, which is in blue, weaning weight, which I guess is yellow, and post-weaning weight, which is orangish color, that there has been change, improvements as a function of people prioritizing and selecting for those traits, right? And what we see that over time per year, there's been very little change in birth weight. That's usually not a mainstay of our selection programs. In fact, we might be worried about it at times getting too heavy. But we do see about 0.2 pound per year improvement in weaning weight and 0.4 in post-weaning weight. So over 10 years, there's been about a 2 pound improvement in weaning weights and a 4 pound improvement in post-weaning weight within these flocks, which is economically important, right? Okay. So that's what we're talking about in response, and that's what we try to predict with this equation, all right? So here are the 4 factors that impact response. How accurate our selection is. So this thing up here is our accuracy. Selection intensity, which is the I. How much variation we have to work with in our breeding value or our genetic merit for the trait. And L is the generation interval. And I'll describe each of those bits, okay? So let's start with accuracy. That's always a key topic that people are interested in. So really, it is no more than measuring the strength, how strong the relationship is between breeding values, true breeding values, and our estimate of it based on our EBV. And clearly, we want that to be a really strong relationship, right? The better job we do with our estimate in relating to our breeding value, the better decision-making we make in terms of our genetic evaluation programs. So we want our EBVs to be accurate. It's affected by 2 key elements. The heritability of a trait, which is really no more than thinking about how closely offspring resemble their parents genetically. So it's all about the genes they inherited from their parents and how closely they resemble each other. And how much we know, how much information is available in order to make our estimate. So those are the 2 key drivers. So let me give you some examples of what I mean by all of that, all right? Oh, and they range from 0 to 1. So you can't have them greater than 1, all right? So here are some illustrations of accuracy. In this first example, I have different sources of information. I have a record on the animal itself, a record only on one of its half-sibs, and a record only on one of its offspring. All right, that's our scenario. And the accuracy is going up the slide. We have 1 record. And I show 3 heritabilities. 0.1 is considered a low heritability. That would be our fertility and fitness traits. Moderate heritability is 0.3, would be some of our growth traits would fit in that category. When we get to 0.5, we're talking about our fleece traits. So that gives you a sense of what those things mean. So this is what you see. So if we only have a single record on the animal itself, for the more lowly heritable trait, our accuracies are about, somewhere about 0.35. It's higher with the 0.3 heritability, and even higher as the heritability goes to 0.5. The point being is as heritability goes up, we're more accurate in estimating breeding values. Okay? That's a key idea. When we use information only on a half-sib, the relationship among the heritabilities don't change. The more highly heritable we are, the higher the accuracy, but we lose accuracy because a measurement isn't on the animal itself, it's on a relative of an animal, on its sibling or on its progeny. We do better with progeny than we do with siblings because progeny have half of the genes from their parents versus siblings are only sharing a quarter of their genes in common. So we do better with information from progeny than we do from half-sibs. Okay? But if we think about it, typically we would only have a single record on a half-sib on progeny. So this is where we actually start improving the accuracy of our evaluations. So along the bottom here, I have the number of half-sibs or offspring. Accuracy still up along that vertical axis. And the first set of lines is the change in the accuracy of our evaluation as we have more records on, in this case, half-sibs. Okay? And the units are simply the number of offspring that we have. So what we see is an improvement as we get more offspring. And notice that for these more highly heritable traits, we don't need that many offspring before it kind of plateaus, right? So we're not learning a lot more by getting a lot more offspring, a lot more half-sibs, I'm talking about half-sibs, for more highly heritable traits than we do for more lowly heritable traits. So for reproductive rate, having lots of daughters in production helps us, right? When we go to progeny information, the whole thing jumps up. We're learning more. Again, there's a plateau. But after we get a certain number of offspring, we're not doing a lot better by collecting more information in terms of accuracy. Okay? So does that make sense to everyone? Higher the heritability, higher the accuracy, more offspring or half-sibs, higher the accuracy, but we hit a plateau where I wouldn't invest more resource in recording because I'm not getting that much for my buck. Okay? That's accuracy. Let's talk about selection intensity. That's really about how selective, how choosy we are as breeders. Basically, by being more intense means we're picking the very best animals. The more intense that selection is, the quicker the rate of genetic response. Okay? So let's take a look at that pragmatically. Say that is weights going from the heaviest to the lightest weight. And in my picture, I am, if I can get this work, picking the top 60%. Okay? So I'm not being really very intensive in my selection. Okay? Say instead I have that same distribution of weights, but I'm picking the top 10%, being much more choosy. Quite sensibly, I think, we make more gain in this scenario than we do in that scenario. And if we think about a breeding program, not exactly, this kind of maybe aligns with what we do with our ram selection. And more or less, that might have to do with what we do with our choosing our ewe replacements. So when we think about response to selection, we often look at it in males separately from females because we're inherently more intensive in our selection of males. All right, so that's selection intensity. Everybody with me still? We good? All right. Third thing, variation in breeding value. This is one we don't have a lot of control over. It's sort of what it is for a particular trait. tends to be fixed within a breed or a population. With intense enough selection, it probably does reduce a bit because we're giving up variation by selecting our very best animals, but that takes a while and hasn't really been a substantial issue in many breeding programs. That doesn't mean that the variation doesn't matter, all right? So it has an impact. Here's an example. These are the 4 breed types that dominate in our industry. We have birth weight, weaning weight, and post-weaning weight in pounds. This is the variation, genetic variation, for each of those traits. Notice they do differ a bit between the different breed types. And notice that they change as we move from trait to trait, right? So if we look at post-weaning weight, we have more genetic variation to work with than we do, for example, birth weight. So what does that mean practically? Well, let's think about it this way. So there's our genetic variation we're working with in birth weight, and say we're picking, say, the top 10%. We'd pick those critters to the right-hand side, right? Well, if we go to weaning weight, it's wider. We have more variation that we're working with. We're still picking the same percentage, and so we're picking them farther to the right. If we move all the way to post-weaning weight, more variation, it's even wider. We're still picking the ones to the right-hand side, and so we're able to actually make more gain for this more variable trait because that distribution becomes wider. So the variation matters, although we can't really control it very easily. All right? That's part 3. All of that's on the top of that lovely breeder's equation. Last bit, generation interval. Generation interval is about the amount of time required to replace one generation with the next, or alternatively, it's thought of as the average age of parents when their offspring are born. So what do those values look like in your flocks? Well, here's some recent work that we have done. Sarah Nilsson is a postdoctoral student working with me. Carrie Wilson is a relatively new geneticist at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, so I credit them for the work that they've done. And this is what we've seen, okay? We have, in males, generation intervals of about 2.5 years. In females, it's closer to 3.5 years. Okay? So we turn our males over more quickly than we turn over our females. And on average, it's somewhere about 3 years in most of our sheep populations. So we're turning over our population about every 3 years, balancing males and females. Okay? So that's the bottom bit. All right. So one caveat that I just at least want to mention. There are relationships among the bits and pieces of these equations. And one of the important is the relationship between accuracy and generation interval. Okay? Accuracy is on the top, generation interval is on the bottom, but the tendency is they move together in the same direction. Accuracy goes up often as generation interval goes up. That's bad news, right? We'd want accuracy to go up, generation interval to go down, because that would make our response quicker. So that is always a challenge in designing a breeding program, is that balance between some of the components. We want high accuracy, low generation interval. We have to find the right sweet spot to make that happen.
Why do they move together?
Well, it's this reason here. In order to become more, sorry, I should have said it and I didn't. In order to become more accurate, we need more information. So to collect more information, it takes more time. And so we keep animals longer in order to collect the additional information, particularly for reproductive traits, and that increases our generation interval. It increases our accuracy as well. So they tend to move together, all right? Comment I want to make about new technology, all right? The only one that I will include, but I have to, all right? Genomics is our savior on this, all right? What genomics allows us to do is to be very accurate or more accurate in our estimate of breeding value in younger animals, so we can increase accuracy without necessarily increasing generation interval. That's a key component of why we like to incorporate genomics into what we do, because it breaks up that antagonistic relationship. All right? So, quiz time. I was serious, all right? Got to pull out, if you have a phone or if you want to participate in this, this is what I want you to do. That is our breeder equation, all right? Those are the bits and pieces for two illustrations, right? Weaning weight, post-weaning weight. I have the accuracy, the selection intensity, the variation breeding value all along the top. I have the generation interval on the bottom. This is strictly in males. So over to you. What do I expect to be the response based on that relationship? No one's, this is like in a classroom. There are no pencils moving. It's scary, you know? I'll give you a second if you want to do that. Oh, there are, sorry. There is a pencil moving.
Ron, that's why we send stuff in.
Is it? But this is not dangerous to do at home. That's what's beautiful about it. So, you know, it's not like blowing fire or, you know, anything like that. You can actually figure this out on your own flock if you so wished. All right. Probably enough time. So let me give you what the answers are. So we have about 0.44 for weaning weight, 0.87 for post-weaning weight. And the question is, why such a difference, right? And the difference goes, oh, and there's my calculations where I put the three first bits on the top and the generation interval on the bottom, and I come up with that calculation. And the reason for that difference has to do with the fact that we're more accurate in our post-weaning, and there's greater variation in it. And that's driving that increase in response for post-weaning weight relative to weaning weight. Okay? All right. So let's put the story together. This is a more realistic scenario that you might see. So I'm going to predict genetic response for weaning weight based on, first, just the individual itself. So I would anticipate about a bit over 0.28 gain per year if I only recorded information on the individual. But if I had a bunch of paternal half-sibs that I collected records on at the same time as that individual was recorded, I see quite a bit of an advantage as I have more paternal half-sibs. Okay? This is what happens basically in the evaluation that you're submitting, right? We're pulling together all of the information on the animal, its relatives, in order to improve that accuracy of the evaluation. That's the benefit of what we do in our system. If we look over here at genetic response for post-weaning gain, again, the same idea. If we only have a record on an individual, we're down here. As we get more paternal half-sibs, that accuracy goes up, response goes up. Okay? So that's the bottom line of that breeder's equation, right? We're thinking about accuracy, intensity, how much variation we have to work with, relative to how quickly we turn over our generations. And this is what drives what we do in a breeding program. This drives the gains that you achieve. Now, I want to put this back into a real context, all right? I've showed you what was actually happening in this breed based on the results in place. And notice the measured response in weaning weight is 0.2, which is lower than what I'm predicting for weaning weight, and about 0.4 for post-weaning, which is less than what I would predict it should be. So everything I've said is complete nonsense, right? You know, what do I do? My God, the world, as I say to students in an exam, panic first and then gather your senses, right? So let's gather our senses as to why this makes some sense. And it is true, and it is defensible. Clearly, when you predict things based on values that are general, they don't explicitly characterize everyone's flock, but there's something more fundamental here. And this is the caveat into establishing a breeding objective or goal, all right? So what is a breeding goal in the first place? Well, we need to think about where we are And we need to recognize that we very seldom will select only for a single trait. We don't only select for weaning weight, or only for post-weaning weight, or for anything else for that matter. And when we think about what the goal of a breeding program is, it's actually a combination of several attributes of an animal. And to optimize profit, we need to consider them all together in our selection programs. Okay? And so a breeding goal really defines where we want to go by combining a variety of traits that affect the economic value of our animals. So what does that mean relative to my challenge that I raised earlier? Well, when we select for a lot more traits at the same time, we inherently make less progress in each one individually. We have to give that up because we're selecting for many, many things at once. Okay? So we anticipate less gain for the individual traits in order to achieve our goal. All right? But we need to be cautious in not overdoing it. We need to only include those traits in our goal that matter economically. And we do that in a selection index. And this is where I get to bail on all of this because my dear colleague, Tom Murphy, in the afternoon session, will be talking about selection indexes that are in place. So you'll get more information on how these traits are combined together in order to define that goal. Okay? So that's the breeding goal. Third topic, interpreting breeding values. What do EBVs actually mean? So again, as a reminder, what we're trying to do is to pull out the G out of the P. That's our goal when we're estimating breeding values. So here is a real example that you can see how this is put into place. All right? I have 5 traits. Maternal weaning weight, which is all about the milkiness, mothering ability of a ewe, post-weaning weight, post-weaning fecal egg count, and a couple reproductive traits, number of lambs born and number of lambs weaned. And these are the breeding values for a pair of sires for those traits. And these are in actual units. So this represents 1.2 pound and 0.6 pound, so forth and so on. Now, the best way to use this information isn't to try to interpret them individually, but what we really want to do is to make a comparison. Think about what you do when you select animals. You don't just look at its breeding value and go, well, I'm just going to pick it. You go, what is its breeding value relative to another animal's breeding value? So we're doing comparisons. So the best way to understand this is that if I picked the first sire, I expect that his genetic value or merit for weaning weight is 0.6 pounds above that of the alternative sire, and all the way down the road. So notice for this sire, he's better in terms of maternal weaning weight, post-weaning weight. Negative is good for fecal egg count. We want it to go down. So he's better in fecal egg count, but he's not quite so good in his reproductive traits. This is where we need to think about balance. And when we interpret that in terms of what we expect their progeny to do, we have to cut that in half because he passes half of his genes to his progeny. So I just divided those numbers by half, and that would be my expectation. If I had a bunch of progeny out of sire A and I compared them to sire B, I expect those out of sire A would weigh on average 0.9 pounds more at post-weaning. That's what it tells me. Okay? So that's how you interpret what these things mean. Defining contemporary group. So we've talked about G. Contemporary group is all about the E. We're trying to remove those environmental effects from the phenotype to do a better job of estimating G, our breeding value, and some things we know about. And that is things like the animal's sex, its age. Some things we know, some things we don't know, like climatic conditions and weather. But what we can do by defining contemporary group is to try to really well define what we know about the environment and get it out of the way. Okay? So here's an example of what we might think about when we define a contemporary group. It might be animals that are managed alike, they're of the same sex, and they're exposed to the same environmental conditions. And by defining contemporary groups well, it's our best way to try to do a good job of estimating breeding values. So here's an example. This is what is truly in place when we define contemporary groups in one of the evaluations underway through NSIP. It's defined by combining the flock and year an animal was born, its management conditions, animals of the same sex, a period in which it was born, and the date in which, say, a weaning record was recorded. And looking at, important point I added in. It is really important that these contemporary groups represent several sires. Otherwise, we get into a fix because all of those conditions that I listed above are entirely intimate with that sire. So how can we pull apart the genetic bit if everything about the environment coincides with that individual animal? So it's really important that contemporary groups include multiple sires to allow us to delineate them in our genetic evaluation. All right? So here's a real example. I pulled out data on nearly 100,000 weaning weights from nearly 5,000 contemporary groups, and I plotted them. So most of them are in the middle at around, 50 pounds. But notice there's huge variation in the means of those categories, which is largely due to different management among those flocks. So if I don't address that when I try to compare genetic evaluation, I'm in a fix, right? So what we do in our genetic evaluation is we look at that contemporary group mean, and we look how individual animals are better or worse than that mean to account for the fact that we believe that most of that is environmental. Okay? And huge variation, as you can see in the contemporary groups for weaning weight. So it really does matter. We need to think about it. Okay? But we also need to think about how we form contemporary groups. So I took that same data and I counted up the frequency based on the number of animals that were plugged into a single contemporary group. So there could be one animal up to, it was nearly 200 animals formed a contemporary group. All right? So if we take a look at this in detail, 35% of those had less than 5 animals in it. All right? That does cause us some problems. All right? You know, contemporary groups need to be large enough that we can really predict the mean of that group well, right? So we need to balance that we have a sufficient number of contemporary groups with them not being too small in size that we do a lousy job of figuring out what the mean performance is. So that balance is pretty key, and I'm a little concerned about what we might be doing now with some very small contemporary groups in a large proportion of cases. All right? Last topic, using crossbreeding. Cool, all right. We have lots of breeds, and they're really cool, and they do different things, right? And the reason that we wish to do crossbreeding is because we can take advantage of those distinct attributes. For example, some animals are known to grow well. Some animals are known to have high reproductive rate. Some animals maybe show greater maternal attributes, right? So we want to combine those to take advantage of those attributes in the crossbred progeny. And we often want to think about what we would use on the male side and the female side. So think about what we do in most of our Western range operations. We take a terminal sire for growth and carcass. We breed it to a white-faced ewe that has good mature size, good maternal ability, and wool, right? So we make a very conscious choice of what we use as the male and what we use as the female to take advantage. But another important part of crossbreeding is something that we call hybrid vigor. And what hybrid vigor is by creating that cross, particularly of very distinct breeds, we create heterozygosity, and that heterozygosity is of an advantage to us, all right? It's greater the more distinct the breeds are. So to put that in real context, this is some results that come out of the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station quite recently with a student that I had the joy to work with for various weights, all right? So along the bottom, I've got birth weight, weaning weight, post-weaning weight, and I have hybrid vigor in percentages, okay? So the darker blue is the advantage of the animal itself being a crossbred. The lighter green is the advantage of that lamb having a crossbred dam. And we refer to that as direct and maternal. So that lamb's growth benefits from both. So if we take a look at traits that probably matter, if we join those together, we're getting about an 8% improvement in weaning weight because of this hybrid vigor. Post-weaning weight, it's even a little bit more. So we're getting that because we're creating those crosses. All this chart did is I smushed it down, same picture before, because I wanted to put it into context of some work that Craig Laymaster had published back in 2002. His advantage in hybrid vigor due to at weaning was very similar to what we came up with, benefit of about 8%, which is substantial. But where it's a real advantage is for the reproductive traits. Huge potential by working with crossbreds to improve numbers of lambs weaned per ewe exposed, and actually the litter weight produced per ewe exposed. So hybrid vigor can create huge opportunity if we utilize our breeds sensibly. What it also allows us to do is to focus a breed on what it does well, and another breed on what it does well, and then we cross them to benefit from both. Sometimes we forget about that in our breeding programs. We want a breed to do everything, okay? So systematically designed crossbreeding programs can be of real advantage. So finishing up, right? It's all about P equals G plus E. The basics is trying to delineate the genetic bit from the phenotype by getting the environment out of the way. And everything else that I spoke about really relates to how we can do that better. And when we get down to crossbreeding, it's how we take advantage of doing all of this well when we cross our breeds to produce the most productive animals. Okay? And with that, I will stop and thank you for your time.